Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. The summer I turned 12, my parents decided we needed a family getaway to reconnect. After my father's recent job promotion had kept him working late for months, they booked a remote log cabin in the mountains of Northern California, promising 4 days of fishing, hiking, and quality time with my grandmother, who had been feeling increasingly isolated since my grandfather's passing the previous winter. As our car wound up the narrow mountain road, towering pine trees pressed close to either side, their branches creating a canopy so thick that only scattered beams of afternoon sunlight penetrated to the forest floor. The GPS signal had died 20 minutes ago, and my mother clutched the printed directions with white knuckles as my father navigated the increasingly treacherous curves. "There it is," my grandmother announced from the passenger seat, pointing a gnarled finger toward a weathered wooden structure that emerged from the tree line like something from a nightmare. The cabin squatted in a small clearing, its dark logs stained nearly black with age and moisture. Several windows had boards nailed across them, and the wraparound porch sagged under the weight of accumulated debris and fallen branches. I felt an immediate sense of unease as the crisp mountain air hit my face when I opened the car door. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant sound of creaking branches and the occasional snap of twigs somewhere in the surrounding darkness of the forest. Even the birds seemed to have abandoned this place. My mother called after me as I approached the front entrance. "Timothy, sweetie, why don't you go up to your room and unpack while your father and I help Grandma get settled?" The cabin door groaned on its hinges as I pushed it open, the sound echoing through what appeared to be a spacious interior. Just inside was a large living area with a faded leather sofa positioned in front of an old television. The kitchen was connected to the main room, separated only by a wooden counter lined with 3 mismatched bar stools. Everything smelled of dust, mildew, and something else I couldn't quite identify. Something organic and unsettling. I climbed the narrow staircase, each step producing an ominous groan under my weight. The upstairs hallway was dimly lit by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting strange shadows on the knotty pine walls. I passed a small bathroom that reeked of stagnant water and continued to the room at the end of the hall that would serve as my quarters for the next 4 nights. The moment I pushed open the bedroom door, I knew something was terribly wrong. The room was sparsely furnished with a twin bed, a small dresser, and a single window that looked out onto the impenetrable forest. But what immediately captured my attention was the grotesque scene in the center of the wooden floor. A rat lay there, its body partially decomposed and torn apart with savage precision. The creature's fur was matted with dried blood, and its internal organs had been pulled from its body cavity and scattered across several square feet. Flies buzzed around the remains, and the stench of decay filled my nostrils, causing my stomach to lurch violently. I bolted downstairs, nearly colliding with my father as he wheeled my grandmother's wheelchair through the front door. "Dad, there's a dead rat in my room," I practically screamed, my voice cracking with terror and disgust. My father, a practical man who prided himself on handling any situation calmly, simply shrugged. "If you're old enough to come on this trip, you're old enough to clean up a dead rodent. There's cleaning supplies under the kitchen sink." I spent the next hour scrubbing the floorboards with bleach and disinfectant, using an entire roll of paper towels to remove every trace of the gruesome scene. But even after the physical evidence was gone, I couldn't shake the image of how precisely the animal had been dismembered, as if something had been feeding on it with methodical care. By evening, the incident with the rat had begun to fade from my immediate thoughts. My mother prepared my favorite meal, macaroni and cheese with sliced hot dogs, and we gathered in the living room to eat while watching an old movie on the television. It was then that I noticed something I had somehow missed during our arrival. In the center of the living room floor, partially concealed by the area rug, was a wooden trapdoor. The hinges were rusted but appeared functional, and there was a small iron ring handle set flush with the surface. "Mom, what's this door for?" I asked, pointing to the opening in the floor. Without looking up from her dinner, she replied, "Probably access to the crawl space. These old mountain cabins need them to prevent flood damage and for maintenance access." The explanation seemed reasonable, and I pushed the discovery from my mind as we finished our meal and prepared for bed. My father had spent the drive up describing all the outdoor activities we would enjoy, fishing in the nearby lake, hiking the mountain trails, and perhaps even spotting some local wildlife. I fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the long car ride and the stress of cleaning up the dead rat. I awoke sometime after midnight to the sound of shuffling movement below me. At first I thought someone in my family might be getting a midnight snack, but as I listened more carefully, I realized the sounds were coming from beneath the floorboards rather than from the kitchen. I crept out of my room, leaving the door slightly open, and made my way to the top of the stairs. The main floor was empty, illuminated only by pale moonlight streaming through the windows. The shuffling continued, accompanied now by what sounded like scratching or scraping against wood. Against every instinct screaming at me to return to my room and lock the door, I descended the stairs and pressed my ear to the floor above the trapdoor. The sounds were definitely originating from the crawl space below, and they suggested something much larger than a rat moving around down there. My 12-year-old mind, filled with both curiosity and a foolish sense of bravery, convinced me that I could handle whatever was making the noise. I retrieved a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and quietly lifted the trapdoor, wincing as the hinges produced a soft squeal. The opening revealed a space much larger than I had anticipated. Rather than a simple crawl space, it appeared to be an extensive network of chambers and tunnels that extended far beyond the footprint of the cabin above. The air that rose from the opening was thick with the smell of decay and human waste, making me gag and cover my nose with my shirt. As I lowered myself into the darkness, my flashlight beam scattered several rats that had been feeding on unidentifiable scraps scattered across the dirt floor. But it was the structure itself that truly unnerved me. Someone had clearly been living down here. There were piles of rags and newspapers arranged like bedding, cans of food stacked against the walls, and crude tools fashioned from pieces of metal and wood. I crawled deeper into the maze-like space, following a trail of debris and animal bones that led toward what appeared to be a larger chamber ahead. The beam of my flashlight danced across the wooden support beams above my head, creating shifting patterns of light and shadow that played tricks on my eyes. In a corner approximately 10 feet ahead of me, something moved. I directed my flashlight toward the source of the movement and immediately wished I hadn't. Crouched in the shadows was a human figure, but one so degraded and transformed by years of living in these conditions that it barely resembled a person anymore. The individual was emaciated to the point of appearing skeletal, with skin that had taken on a grayish pallor from lack of sunlight. Matted hair hung in clumps around a face that was barely recognizable as human, with wild eyes that reflected my flashlight beam like an animal's. The person, if that's what it still was, had apparently been living beneath this cabin for an unknown period of time, surviving on whatever small animals it could catch and whatever supplies it could scavenge. Its fingernails had grown into claw-like appendages, and its teeth, when it opened its mouth to emit a sound that was part scream and part growl, appeared to have been filed or worn down to points. For a moment that seemed to last an eternity, we stared at each other in mutual shock. Then the creature began to move toward me with surprising speed, using its elongated limbs to pull itself forward while maintaining its crouched position. The sounds it made were unlike anything I had ever heard, a combination of human vocalization and animal snarling that spoke of a mind that had long since abandoned rational thought. I turned and began crawling back toward the trapdoor as fast as my trembling limbs would carry me. Behind me, I could hear the thing following, its movements accompanied by a wet breathing sound that suggested severe respiratory damage from years of living in the damp, mold-infested environment. The distance back to the trapdoor seemed impossibly far, and with each foot I covered, I could hear my pursuer gaining ground. At one point, I made the mistake of glancing back and saw elongated fingers reaching out toward my ankle, close enough that I could feel the disturbed air from its grasping motions. When I finally reached the opening, I practically launched myself through it, scrambling onto the living room floor and immediately slamming the trapdoor shut behind me. Something struck the underside of the wooden panel with tremendous force, and I threw my entire body weight on top of it to keep it closed while whatever was below clawed and pounded at the barrier. After several minutes that felt like hours, the struggling beneath the floor subsided, and I sprinted upstairs to my parents' bedroom. I pounded on their door, screaming for help. But when my father groggily emerged, he dismissed my story as the product of an overactive imagination and a nightmare brought on by the stress of being in a new place. "Timothy, you're 12 years old," he said with the exasperated tone of a parent dealing with what he perceived as childish fears. "There's nothing living under our cabin except maybe some mice. Go back to bed." No amount of pleading or description of what I had seen could convince him to investigate. I was sent back to my room, where I spent the remainder of the night sitting in the corner with my back against the wall, clutching a kitchen knife I had grabbed on my way upstairs, listening for any sound that might indicate the thing had found another way into the main cabin. The following day passed in a haze of forced normalcy. We went fishing on the nearby lake, and my father was pleased when I caught a small bass on my second cast. We hiked a portion of the mountain trail system, and my grandmother seemed to enjoy being outdoors despite the difficulty of navigating her wheelchair over the rough terrain. But as evening approached and we returned to the cabin, my anxiety began to build exponentially. I couldn't eat the dinner my mother prepared, and I found myself constantly checking the trapdoor to ensure it remained securely closed. That night, I lay in bed fully clothed, a kitchen knife hidden under my pillow and my flashlight clutched in my sweating palm. I had wedged a chair under my doorknob and positioned myself so I could see both the door and the window, though I doubted my ability to escape through the second-story opening if necessary. Around 2 a.m., I heard the unmistakable sound of the trapdoor being opened. This time, however, the creature didn't remain in the crawl space. I listened in terror as footsteps moved across the living room floor, followed by the sounds of cabinet doors being opened and closed in the kitchen. Whatever was down there had grown bold enough to explore the main cabin, perhaps looking for food or investigating the source of the noise and activity it had been hearing above its head. The footsteps began ascending the stairs, each creak of the wooden steps sending waves of panic through my body. I gripped the knife handle so tightly that my knuckles turned white, and I found myself struggling to breathe as the sounds moved down the hallway toward my room. The doorknob to my room turned slowly, but the chair I had wedged beneath it held firm. For several seconds there was silence, followed by the sound of fingernails scratching against the wooden door. Then came a sound that will haunt me for the rest of my life, a voice that was unmistakably human but distorted by years of disuse and damage, whispering my name. "Timothy, Timothy, I know you're in there." How it knew my name I couldn't comprehend, but hearing that broken voice speaking to me through the door nearly caused me to lose consciousness from terror. The scratching continued, growing more frantic, and I could see the door beginning to shake as the thing threw its weight against it. Just as I was certain the barrier would give way, I heard another door opening in the hallway, followed by my father's voice shouting, "Get away from there!" There was an ear-splitting shriek unlike anything I had ever heard, followed by the sound of shattering glass and running footsteps. I managed to remove the chair and open my door to find my father standing in the hallway holding his fishing knife, which was now stained with blood. At the end of the hall, the bathroom window had been smashed from the inside, with glass scattered across the floor and a trail of blood leading to the opening. "Dad, what was that thing?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. My father's face was pale, and his hands were shaking as he lowered the knife. "I don't know, son, but we're leaving, right now." We packed our belongings in less than 20 minutes and loaded the car in the darkness, my grandmother asking confused questions that no one answered. As we drove away from that cursed place, I looked back once to see a figure silhouetted in the broken bathroom window, watching our departure with those terrible reflecting eyes. We never spoke of what happened at the cabin, and my family has avoided wilderness vacations ever since. But sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I still wake up thinking I hear scratching sounds and whispered voices calling my name from somewhere beneath the floor. If you ever find yourself in an unfamiliar place and hear sounds that don't belong, trust your instincts. Leave immediately. Some things that hide in the darkness are far worse than any nightmare your imagination could create, and some encounters leave scars that never fully heal. The creature we encountered that night was human once. I'm certain of that. But years of isolation, desperation, and madness had transformed it into something else entirely. A reminder that the most terrifying monsters are often the ones that were once just like us. The summer I turned 9 years old, my family rented a cottage in a remote part of northern Ontario, far from the urban sprawl where we normally lived. It was 2015, and my parents thought a month away from the city would do us all some good. The cottage community consisted of 12 small buildings arranged in a perfect semicircle around a central park area, like wooden soldiers standing guard over a patch of grass and playground equipment. Our cottage sat at the far end of the arc, number 11. With only one neighbor to our right and the dark wall of pine and oak forest stretching endlessly to our left. The building itself was modest. 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a living area that smelled perpetually of cedar and old wool blankets. The walls were thin enough that you could hear everything. Footsteps on creaky floorboards, hushed conversations through bedroom doors, and most unsettling of all, the sounds that came from the woods at night. My older brother Logan and I shared the smaller of the 2 bedrooms, sleeping in bunk beds that had seen decades of summer visitors. Logan was 12, tall for his age, with the kind of confidence that came from being the older sibling. He had a way of making me feel both protected and completely inadequate at the same time. I worshipped him with the blind devotion that only a younger brother could muster, which meant I followed him everywhere, even when my gut told me not to. The first few days were peaceful enough. We explored the immediate area around the cottages, played on the swing set in the central park, and threw stones into the small creek that ran behind cottage number 6. Our parents seemed relaxed for the first time in months, sitting on the front porch in the evenings with glasses of wine, talking in low voices about work stress and city life. But by the 4th day, both Logan and I were growing restless. The park had lost its novelty. The creek was too shallow for anything interesting, and the other families kept to themselves. Most of the cottage occupants were older couples or families with very young children. There was nobody our age to befriend, nobody to break the monotony of what was beginning to feel more like exile than vacation. That's when we met Tyler. Tyler appeared on our 5th morning like a bad omen. I was sitting on our front steps, picking at a scab on my knee, when I noticed him walking across the park area with a deliberate swagger that immediately caught my attention. He was older than Logan, maybe 14 or 15, with shaggy brown hair that hung in his eyes and clothes that looked like he'd slept in them. There was something about the way he moved that set off alarm bells in my head, a predatory confidence that reminded me of the older kids at school who enjoyed making younger ones miserable. Logan noticed him too. I watched my brother straighten up, suddenly conscious of his posture, the way he always did when he wanted to appear older than he was. Tyler approached our cottage directly, as if he'd been planning this meeting for days. "You're the new kids," he said without preamble. It wasn't a question. His voice was deeper than I expected, already changing in that awkward way that marked the transition from boy to teenager. Up close, I could see that his eyes were an unusual pale green, almost colorless in the morning light. "We're here for the month," Logan replied, trying to match Tyler's casual tone but not quite succeeding. "I'm Logan. This is my brother." I gave my name reluctantly, something about Tyler making me want to remain invisible. He looked me up and down with an expression that somehow managed to be both dismissive and calculating at the same time. "Cool. There's nothing to do around here during the day," Tyler said, sitting down uninvited on our front steps. "But nights are different. Way different." Over the next hour, Tyler regaled us with stories of his summer adventures. He'd been coming to cottage number 3 with his grandparents for the past 4 years, he claimed, and knew every inch of the area. According to him, the real fun didn't start until after dark. He talked about midnight excursions to an abandoned railway bridge 3 miles north, about a hidden swimming hole deep in the woods where the water was so clear you could see fish swimming 20 feet down, about places where you could find artifacts left behind by old logging camps. Logan hung on every word, his eyes bright with the kind of excitement that came from the promise of forbidden adventure. I, on the other hand, found myself growing more uncomfortable with each story. There was something off about Tyler's tales. Details that didn't quite add up. Descriptions that seemed more like scenes from horror movies than real experiences. But Logan was hooked, and when Tyler casually mentioned that he snuck out most nights, my brother's fate was sealed. By the time our parents called us in for lunch, plans had already been made for that evening's expedition. I protested weakly, suggesting we ask permission first, but Tyler just laughed. "Parents don't understand adventure," he said with the authority of someone who'd clearly had this conversation before. "They think danger is everywhere, but that's just because they've forgotten what it's like to really live." As we watched Tyler walk back toward Cottage 3, Logan was practically vibrating with anticipation. I felt sick to my stomach. That night, I lay in the bottom bunk listening to Logan toss and turn above me, both of us waiting for the right moment. Our parents had gone to bed around 10:30, and we'd agreed to meet Tyler at 11. The cottage was never truly quiet. The old wood creaked and settled constantly, the refrigerator hummed in the kitchen, and outside, the night sounds of rural Ontario created a constant backdrop of cricket chirps and rustling leaves. At exactly 11 o'clock, Logan dropped down from the top bunk with practiced silence. We'd done this before, sneaking out of our house back home, but never somewhere unfamiliar, never somewhere this isolated. He'd already laid out dark clothes for both of us, and we dressed quickly in the dim light filtering through our bedroom window. Getting out of the cottage proved easier than expected. The front door opened without so much as a squeak, and we slipped into the cool night air like a pair of guilty shadows. The temperature had dropped at least 15 degrees since sunset, and I immediately regretted not bringing a jacket. But Logan was already moving toward the park, and I had no choice but to follow. Tyler was waiting by the swing set, a dark silhouette against the slightly less dark sky. He had a small LED flashlight in his hand, the kind that produced a harsh blue-white beam that seemed to make shadows deeper rather than illuminating anything useful. "About time," he whispered as we approached. "I was starting to think you chickened out." "We're here," Logan replied, a defensive edge to his voice that told me he'd been having his own second thoughts. For the first hour, our midnight adventure was everything Tyler had promised. We explored the areas around the cottages that we'd only seen in daylight, discovering that the landscape looked completely different after dark. Familiar landmarks became alien and threatening, while previously hidden features revealed themselves in the flashlight's narrow beam. Tyler led us to a small clearing behind Cottage 8 where someone had built a fire pit years earlier. The charred stones were still there, along with rusty beer cans and cigarette butts that spoke of other clandestine gatherings. He'd brought matches and a small bundle of kindling, and within minutes we had a modest fire crackling in the pit. Sitting around the flames, Tyler regaled us with more stories, these ones darker and more disturbing than his daytime tales. He spoke of strange sounds that came from the deep woods on moonless nights, of lights that moved between the trees with no apparent source, of a local legend about something that had been killing livestock in the area for decades. "My grandmother told me about it," he said, his face half in shadow from the firelight. "Back in the 70s, they found 3 cows torn apart just a few miles from here. Not eaten, torn apart, like something had just wanted to destroy them. The police never figured out what did it." Logan was enthralled, but the stories made my skin crawl. I kept glancing toward the tree line, expecting to see glowing eyes staring back at us. Every snapping twig or rustling branch made me jump, and I found myself sitting closer and closer to the fire as the night wore on. Eventually, Tyler declared that we should explore further. The fire was burning low anyway, and according to him, we'd barely scratched the surface of what the area had to offer. I suggested we head back. It was already well past midnight, but I was immediately outvoted. "The night's just getting started," Tyler said, kicking dirt over the dying embers. "Besides, this is when things get really interesting." Tyler led us away from the cottage community and toward the forest that bordered the eastern edge of the property. Up close, the tree line looked like a solid wall of black, impenetrable and unwelcoming. The flashlight beam seemed pitifully weak against such overwhelming darkness, creating a small bubble of visibility that only served to emphasize how much we couldn't see. "There's a path about 50 yards in," Tyler explained, pushing through the undergrowth with the confidence of someone who'd done this many times before. "It's an old logging road, mostly grown over now, but you can still follow it pretty easily." The trees were primarily oak and maple, their branches forming a canopy so thick that even the faint starlight disappeared within moments of entering the woods. Our footsteps seemed unnaturally loud on the carpet of dead leaves, and more than once I thought I heard something large moving parallel to our path, just beyond the reach of the flashlight. Logan walked directly behind Tyler, trying to project the same fearless attitude but failing to hide the tension in his shoulders. I brought up the rear, constantly looking over my shoulder and jumping at every sound. The temperature seemed to drop another 10 degrees once we were under the canopy, and I was shivering almost immediately. "How far are we going?" I asked, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. "Not much further," Tyler replied, but something in his tone suggested he wasn't entirely sure himself. "There's this clearing I want to show you. It's different." We walked for what felt like hours but was probably only 20 or 30 minutes. The old logging road was barely visible, more of a slightly less dense area between the trees than an actual path. Several times we had to backtrack when Tyler admitted he'd taken a wrong turn, and with each course correction I became more convinced that we were hopelessly lost. The woods around us were alive with sound, not the peaceful chirping of crickets and the gentle rustle of wind through leaves that you might expect, but something more unsettling. There were scrabbling sounds in the undergrowth, sudden crashes as something large moved through the branches above us, and most disturbing of all, what sounded like breathing that wasn't our own. "Do you hear that?" I whispered during one of our stops, when Tyler was trying to get his bearings. "Hear what?" Logan asked, but he was listening too, his head tilted to one side. The breathing was subtle but unmistakable once you noticed it. A slow, rhythmic sound that seemed to come from all around us. It was too deep and too regular to be coming from any of the small animals we might expect to encounter, and too widespread to be coming from a single source. "It's just the wind," Tyler said, but his voice lacked conviction. He was listening too now, his earlier bravado fading as the reality of our situation began to sink in. We continued deeper into the woods, following what Tyler insisted was the right path. But I noticed that he was gripping the flashlight tighter now, swinging the beam back and forth more frantically as if trying to pierce the darkness through sheer determination. The breathing sound continued, sometimes louder, sometimes softer, but never completely absent. It was Logan who first noticed when the breathing stopped. We'd been walking for another 10 minutes when he suddenly held up his hand, bringing our small procession to an abrupt halt. "Listen," he whispered. We stood motionless in the middle of what Tyler claimed was still the old logging road, straining our ears in the darkness. The absence of sound was so complete, it was almost physical, pressing against our eardrums with its weight. No breathing, no rustling leaves, no insect chirps, no wind through the branches, nothing. "That's weird," Tyler said, trying to maintain his air of expertise but clearly unnerved by the sudden change. "Usually the woods are pretty noisy at night." The silence stretched on, becoming more oppressive with each passing second. I found myself holding my breath without realizing it, as if making any sound might attract unwanted attention. Logan was doing the same thing, his face pale in the flashlight's glow. Then Tyler made a decision that, looking back, I realized was the moment everything went wrong. Instead of suggesting we turn back, he declared that we should keep moving. "We're almost there anyway," he said, though I noticed he hadn't been able to identify any landmarks for the past 20 minutes. "Besides, it's probably just, I don't know, maybe there's a storm coming or something." There was no storm coming. The night sky, what little we could see of it through the canopy, was clear and studded with stars. But Logan nodded agreement, and I was trapped between my fear of continuing and my greater fear of being left alone in the woods. We resumed walking, our footsteps now sounding thunderously loud in the unnatural quiet. The flashlight beam seemed weaker somehow, as if the darkness was actively fighting back against the light. Shadows moved at the edge of our vision, just quick enough and just far enough away that we couldn't be sure if they were real or tricks of our frightened minds. After another few minutes, Tyler stopped again, this time with genuine uncertainty. "I think we might have taken a wrong turn back there," he admitted, sweeping the flashlight beam in a full circle. The light revealed nothing but trees in every direction. No path, no landmarks, nothing that might indicate which way we'd come from or which way we should go. "What do you mean, wrong turn?" Logan's voice cracked slightly on the last word. "I mean, I'm not exactly sure where we are," Tyler replied, and for the first time since we'd met him, he sounded like the scared teenager he really was, rather than the confident guide he'd been pretending to be. The silence around us seemed to deepen, if such a thing was possible. It wasn't just the absence of normal forest sounds now. It was as if the entire world had been muted, as if we'd stepped into some dead zone where sound itself couldn't exist. That's when I heard the breathing again, but this time it was different. Louder, more labored, and definitely coming from a single source rather than seeming to emanate from the woods around us. It sounded like something large struggling for air, like a person with severe asthma trying to climb a flight of stairs. "Okay, now I hear it too," Logan whispered, his voice barely audible. The three of us stood frozen, listening to the harsh, rasping breaths that seemed to be getting closer. Tyler swung the flashlight wildly, trying to locate the source of the sound, but the beam revealed nothing but empty forest in every direction. The breathing grew louder and more labored, until it sounded like whatever was making it was in genuine distress. But there was something else mixed in with the harsh inhalations. A sound that made my skin crawl and my stomach clench with primitive fear. It was excitement. The breathing wasn't just labored, it was eager, anticipatory, like a predator that had found its prey. "We need to get out of here," I whispered, finally finding my voice. "We need to go back right now." But before anyone could respond, the breathing stopped completely, and in the sudden silence that followed, we heard something that made Logan grab my arm so hard it left bruises. Above us, somewhere in the canopy, branches were creaking and swaying as if something large was moving through them. Tyler aimed the flashlight upward, and that's when we saw the lights. They were brilliant blue, brighter than anything natural, and they swayed back and forth about 20 feet above our heads. At first glance, they looked like some kind of bioluminescent fungus, or maybe reflected light from a passing aircraft. But as we watched, frozen with terror, it became clear that they were moving with purpose, tracking back and forth as if they were scanning the ground below, as if they were searching for us. The lights suddenly focused on our location, and in that blue illumination I could make out shapes in the branches above that shouldn't have been there. Something large and angular, moving with fluid grace despite its size, repositioning itself for a better view of the three terrified children below. That's when we heard them moan. I've spent years trying to find words to describe that sound, and I've never been successful. It was human and animal at the same time, expressing a level of need and hunger that bypassed rational thought and went straight to the most primitive parts of the brain. It sounded like grief and rage and desperate longing all rolled into one horrifying vocalization that seemed to go on forever. The sound broke whatever spell had been holding us motionless. Logan let go of my arm and bolted, crashing through the underbrush in what he hoped was the direction of the cottage community. Tyler was right behind him, abandoning all pretense of leadership and running with the pure panic of a cornered animal. I tried to follow, but I'd never been much of a runner. My coordination had always been poor, a fact that had been the source of constant frustration in gym class and playground games. Within 50 yards I was falling behind, my lungs burning and my legs feeling like they were made of rubber. Behind me, I could hear something crashing through the trees, keeping pace with our flight but not quite catching up. The blue lights were moving too, paralleling our path through the canopy, and occasionally I caught glimpses of them through the leaves above. Logan and Tyler quickly outdistanced me, their flashlight disappearing into the darkness ahead and leaving me stumbling blind through the forest. I could still hear them running, but the sound was growing fainter with each passing second. Soon, I was alone in the woods with whatever had been stalking us. My legs finally gave out completely about 100 yards from where we'd first seen the lights. I collapsed behind what I hoped was a large enough tree to provide some concealment, gasping for air and trying not to make any sound that might give away my location. The crashing sounds stopped almost immediately, as if whatever had been pursuing us knew exactly where I was and no longer needed to hurry. In the silence that followed, I became aware that the blue lights were much closer now, almost directly overhead, casting everything around me in an eerie underwater glow. I pressed myself against the tree trunk and tried to become invisible, but I knew it was useless. Those lights were searching for me with the methodical patience of something that knew its prey had nowhere left to run. That's when I heard it land. The impact shook the ground beneath me, a heavy thud that suggested something much larger than any animal native to Ontario had just dropped from the trees. I bit down on my knuckle to keep from crying out, tasting blood as my teeth broke the skin. Through the gaps in the undergrowth, I could see the blue lights moving at ground level now, no longer 20 feet above, but close enough that they cast my hiding spot in stark relief. The lights swept back and forth with mechanical precision, searching every shadow, every possible place of concealment. When they found me, I got my first clear look at the thing that had been hunting us. It stood upright like a human, but wrong in every other way. 7 feet tall at least, with limbs that were too long and joints that bent at impossible angles. Its skin was gray-black, stretched taut over a frame that looked like it was made of coat hangers and piano wire. The arms reached almost to the ground, ending in hands that were more like bundles of finger bones held together by sinew. But it was the torso that made me understand I was looking at something that shouldn't exist. The chest cavity was split open, ribs spread wide like the wings of some massive bird. There was no sternum, just a gaping cavity where the heart and lungs should have been, filled instead with a writhing mass of black tissue that pulsed and contracted with its own rhythm. The blue lights were its eyes, set in a skull that was too narrow and too long, like someone had taken a human head and stretched it in all the wrong directions. The face below those eyes was mercifully hidden in shadow, but I could see the wet gleam of teeth that were far too sharp and far too numerous. It knew I was there. Even as I held perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe, those blue lights fixed on my location with absolute certainty. It took a step forward, then another, moving with the careful deliberation of something that had all the time in the world. I don't know what made me move. Maybe it was pure panic. Maybe some deeper survival instinct that finally overcame my paralysis. But something inside me snapped, and I bolted from behind the tree, crashing through the underbrush with no plan except to get as far away as possible. The thing behind me made that moaning sound again, closer now, filled with what sounded like pleasure. I could hear it following, not running but moving with the same patient pursuit, as if it knew I couldn't maintain this pace for long. I ran until my vision started to gray at the edges, until each breath felt like swallowing broken glass, until my legs finally buckled and I collapsed face first into a thorn bush that tore my pajamas to shreds and left me bleeding from dozens of small cuts. The thorns were agony, but they also provided perfect camouflage. I burrowed deeper into the bush, feeling the barbs tear at my skin but not caring, focused only on becoming as small and invisible as possible. Through the tangle of thorns, I watched those blue lights search the area where I'd fallen. The creature moved in widening circles, systematic and thorough, coming close enough that I could hear its breathing, that same labored, eager sound that had first alerted us to its presence. It stayed for what felt like hours, hunting for me in the darkness. Several times it came close enough that I could have reached out and touched those impossibly long legs, close enough that I could smell it, a mixture of decay and something else, something like ozone or burning metal. But the thorn bush held my secret, and eventually the blue lights moved away, disappearing deeper into the woods. I stayed hidden until I saw the first hint of dawn filtering through the canopy, until I was sure beyond any doubt that I was alone. The journey back to the cottage community was a nightmare of its own. I was lost, injured, and wearing nothing but the torn remnants of my pajamas. It took me most of the morning to find my way back to anything resembling civilization, stumbling out of the woods and onto Highway 11 just as the early commuter traffic was beginning. The driver who found me later told the police that I looked like I'd been attacked by a wild animal. I was covered in blood from the thorn bush, delirious from exhaustion and fear, and babbling about blue lights and impossible creatures. He called 911 from his cell phone and stayed with me until the ambulance arrived. I spent 2 days in the hospital in North Bay while doctors cleaned my wounds and made sure I didn't have a concussion. My parents drove up immediately, of course, and Logan was there when I woke up the first time, looking guilty and scared and younger than his 12 years. He told me that he and Tyler had made it back to the cottage community around 3 in the morning, both of them convinced that I was right behind them. It wasn't until Tyler went back to his grandparents' cottage that Logan realized I wasn't there. He'd waited until dawn before finally waking our parents, hoping against hope that I would appear before he had to admit what we'd been doing. The search party that went looking for me found nothing. No tracks, no signs of the creature I described. Nothing but the normal wildlife and vegetation you'd expect in a northern Ontario forest. The police were polite but skeptical when I tried to tell them what had happened, clearly convinced that a 9-year-old's imagination had run wild during a night alone in the woods. My parents were just grateful to have me back alive. They never punished Logan or me for sneaking out. I think they were too shaken by how close they'd come to losing one of their children. We left the cottage community that same day, and never spoke of returning. Tyler and his family were gone by the time we got back from the hospital. According to the cottage manager, they'd packed up and left in the middle of the night with no explanation and no forwarding address. The manager seemed to think there had been some kind of family emergency but couldn't provide any details. I never saw Tyler again, and despite years of searching through social media and online directories, I've never been able to find any trace of him. It's as if he simply disappeared that night, leaving behind no record of his existence except for the memories of 2 terrified brothers. That was 8 years ago. I'm 17 now, and I've spent those 8 years trying to make sense of what happened in the woods that night. I've researched every cryptid, every urban legend, every reported sighting of unusual creatures in northern Ontario and the surrounding areas. I've read scientific papers about mass hallucinations and sleep deprivation, psychological studies about childhood trauma and false memories. Nothing I've found comes close to explaining what I saw. The rational part of my mind, the part that's been shaped by years of education and skeptical inquiry, knows that what I experienced was impossible. Human beings don't have glowing blue eyes. Creatures with exposed chest cavities can't survive, let alone hunt through forests with the intelligence and purpose I witnessed. The whole thing has to be some combination of darkness, fear, and an overactive imagination. But I still have the scars from the thorn bush. I still wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, listening for that labored breathing sound. And sometimes when I'm driving through rural areas after dark, I find myself scanning the tree line for blue lights that I know aren't there. Logan and I never talked about it after that first day in the hospital. It was as if we'd made an unspoken agreement to pretend it never happened, to file it away with childhood monsters and imaginary friends. He went on to become a star athlete in high school, confident and popular, apparently untroubled by that night in the woods. But I've noticed that he doesn't like camping anymore, and he still leaves lights on when he sleeps. I'm writing this now because I've finally accepted that I'll never have a satisfactory explanation for what happened that night. I'll never find scientific evidence for the creature I encountered, never locate Tyler to confirm that he experienced the same thing, never convince anyone that my 9-year-old memories are anything more than the product of trauma and imagination. But I know what I saw. I know what hunted us through those dark woods, what waited with inhuman patience for us to separate so it could take one of us. And I know that somewhere in the forests of northern Ontario, it's still out there, still waiting, still breathing in the dark. My name is Edward King, and I am 67 years old. This is the story of what happened to me on June 23, 1998, during my annual solo camping trip. It was supposed to be a break from the city grind, a chance to escape the constant noise of my construction business and find some peace in nature. Little did I know that this trip would change my life forever. I had chosen a lesser-known spot near the Black Hills in South Dakota for my getaway. An old friend had told me about it, describing it as perfect for those seeking true solitude. No cell service, no people, just me and the wild. It sounded like paradise to a man who'd spent the better part of his life surrounded by the clamor of jackhammers and shouting foremen. The drive was long, but I didn't mind. My trusty old RV, which I'd retrofitted myself with a small kitchenette and a cozy sleeping area, hummed along the highway. I passed through small towns, the kind where everyone knows everyone else's business. In one of these towns, I stopped to stock up on supplies. I grabbed some extra food, a new flashlight, and a couple of cheap novels to keep me entertained during the quiet evenings. By the time I reached the campsite, it was late afternoon. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows through the thick pine forest that surrounded the area. I found a clearing that overlooked a small stream and parked the RV. It was idyllic. The babbling of the water over rocks, the chirping of birds, and the rustle of leaves in the breeze created a symphony of nature that instantly soothed my nerves. I set up a small campfire, cooked myself a simple dinner of beans and sausages, and settled in to read one of the novels I'd bought. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks dancing into the darkening sky. As night fell, the forest came alive with a different kind of music, the hooting of owls, the chirping of crickets, and the occasional rustle in the underbrush. It was around midnight when I first heard the noise. At first it was faint, almost imperceptible over the crackle of the dying fire and the sounds of the night, a sort of scratching, rustling sound, like something moving through the underbrush. I figured it was just a raccoon or some other small critter, so I didn't pay it much mind. I finished my book and headed to bed, the noise still tickling the edge of my awareness. I woke up in the middle of the night to a loud thump against the side of the RV. My heart pounded as I lay there listening. There it was again, a heavy, deliberate sound, like something or someone was hitting the RV. I grabbed my flashlight and a large wrench, the closest thing I had to a weapon. I crept to the window and shined the light outside. Nothing, just the trees and the stream, now a shadowy blur in the moonlight. I decided to step outside, thinking it might be a fallen branch, or maybe a deer that had stumbled into the RV. As I opened the door, the night air hit me, cool and sharp. I scanned the area with my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. That's when I saw it, a large dark shape moving just beyond the reach of the light. It was big, bigger than any animal I'd ever seen in these parts. I froze, my mind racing through possibilities. A bear? No, it moved too quickly, too fluidly. "Hello?" I called out, feeling foolish the moment the word left my mouth. There was no response, just the sound of the stream and the rustling of leaves. I backed up slowly, my heart hammering in my chest, and retreated into the RV, locking the door behind me. Sleep was out of the question. I sat there, wrench in hand, listening. But whatever it was, it didn't make any more noise. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I ventured outside again. What I found made my blood run cold. The side of the RV was scratched up, deep gouges in the metal that looked like they'd been made by enormous claws. I shook my head, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was a bear after all, though I'd never heard of one behaving like this. I decided to stay put, thinking it might just have been a fluke, a curious animal passing through. The day passed uneventfully. I hiked around the area, took some pictures, even tried my hand at fishing in the stream, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming just yesterday, now felt oppressive, the trees closing in around me. I chalked it up to nerves and decided to turn in early, hoping a good night's sleep would set me straight. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside the RV. They were heavy, deliberate, and they circled the vehicle slowly. My breath caught in my throat. I grabbed the wrench again and stood by the door listening. The footsteps stopped, and there was a long, eerie silence. Then a low scraping sound, like claws being dragged across metal. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. No response. I didn't dare open the door this time. Instead, I peered through the small window. I couldn't see anything, just darkness and the faint outline of trees. The scraping continued, methodical and terrifying. I spent the rest of the night huddled in a corner, the wrench clutched tightly in my hand. As dawn broke, the noises stopped, replaced by the sounds of morning birds and the babbling stream. I stepped outside, my legs shaky, and inspected the damage. More scratches, deeper this time, and what looked like bite marks on the edge of the door. That was it. I decided to leave. I packed up my things, securing everything inside the RV, and started the engine. But the RV wouldn't start. I tried again and again, but nothing. It was dead. I felt a wave of panic wash over me. I was miles from the nearest town, with no cell service and no way to call for help. I spent the day trying to fix the engine, but I'm no mechanic. By afternoon, I realized I wasn't going to get it running on my own. I'd have to hike out to the nearest town. I packed a bag with some essentials, water, food, flashlight, and my wrench, and started walking. The trail was overgrown and rarely used, but I'd marked it on my map. The sun was setting as I walked, casting long shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. I kept hearing noises behind me, twigs snapping, leaves rustling. I turned around several times but saw nothing. I picked up the pace, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I saw the first body. It was an old man, his clothes tattered and covered in dirt and blood. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the sky. I knelt down, feeling for a pulse, but he was cold, dead for at least a day, maybe more. I felt sick, my stomach churning. What the hell was going on? I didn't have time to think. I heard a noise behind me, a low guttural sound that made my blood run cold. I turned slowly, and there it was, the creature. It was huge, towering over me, covered in matted fur. Its eyes glowed in the dim light, and its teeth, sharp and menacing, gleamed as it opened its mouth. I ran. I didn't look back, didn't think, just ran as fast as I could. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the underbrush, getting closer. My lungs burned. My legs felt like they were on fire, but I kept going. I burst out of the trees into a small clearing and saw a cabin. I sprinted towards it, hoping against hope that someone was inside. I reached the door and pounded on it, screaming for help. The door opened and an old woman stood there, her eyes wide with shock. She pulled me inside and slammed the door shut, bolting it quickly. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice trembling. "There's something out there," I gasped, trying to catch my breath. "It killed someone. It's after me." She nodded grimly and handed me a shotgun. "Stay here. Don't let it in." I took the gun, my hands shaking. The creature was outside, circling the cabin. We could hear it, the heavy footsteps, the scratching at the walls. The old woman and I stood back to back, watching the doors and windows, waiting. It was hours before the noises stopped. The sun was starting to rise, and the creature seemed to retreat with the daylight. The old woman, whose name I learned was Agnes, told me she'd seen the creature before, years ago. It had taken her husband and son, leaving her alone in this cabin. "It's been here for as long as anyone can remember," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Some say it's a guardian spirit. Others think it's a demon. All I know is it's dangerous." I stayed with Agnes for a few more days, helping her reinforce the cabin and making sure the creature didn't come back. When I finally felt it was safe to leave, She gave me directions to the nearest town, about a day's walk away. I made it to the town and called for help. The authorities went back to the campsite, but there was no sign of the creature. They found the bodies, though, 3 more, in various stages of decomposition. All of them had the same claw marks and bite wounds. I never went back to that spot, and I don't camp alone anymore. The memory of that night still haunts me, the sound of those footsteps, the sight of those glowing eyes. I don't know what that creature really was, but I know it's still out there, somewhere in the Black Hills, waiting for its next victim. In the years since that fateful camping trip, I've done a lot of research. I've talked to local historians, Native American elders, and even a few cryptozoologists. Everyone has a different theory about what the creature might be, but no one has any concrete answers. Some of the Native American elders spoke of an ancient legend, a creature they called the Shadow Walker. According to their stories, it was a spirit that protected the sacred lands of the Black Hills, punishing those who disrespected nature. But the brutality I witnessed seemed at odds with the idea of a protective spirit. Others suggested it might be some kind of undiscovered species, a relic from prehistoric times that had somehow survived in the isolated wilderness of the Black Hills. The cryptozoologists were particularly excited by this theory, drawing comparisons to creatures like Bigfoot or the Yeti. But none of these explanations could fully account for what I had experienced. The intelligence I had sensed in those glowing eyes, the deliberate way it had stalked me. It seemed too calculated, too human-like to be a mere animal. I've spent countless nights lying awake, replaying the events in my mind, trying to make sense of it all. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, if the stress of my job and the isolation of the camping trip had caused some kind of mental break. But then I remember the claw marks on my RV, the bodies in the forest, and I know it was all too real. The experience changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. I sold my construction business not long after I returned from that trip. The noise and chaos of the city, which I had once found invigorating, now felt oppressive and overwhelming. I moved to a small town, seeking the peace I had once found in nature but now struggled to recapture. I've tried to move on with my life, to put the events of that night behind me. But every now and then, something will trigger a memory. The crack of a twig in the woods behind my house, a shadow moving at the edge of my vision, the howl of a distant animal that sounds just a little too human. And in those moments, I'm right back there in the Black Hills, running for my life, the creature's hot breath on the back of my neck. In those moments, I remember the words Agnes told me before I left her cabin. It's always out there waiting, and it never forgets a scent. I've often wondered about Agnes in the years since. Did she stay in that cabin, alone with her memories and her fear? Or did she finally leave, unable to bear the weight of her losses and the constant threat lurking in the forest? I've thought about going back, just to check on her, but the fear always holds me back. Sometimes, late at night when the wind is howling and the shadows seem to dance on my walls, I find myself reaching for the phone, ready to call the authorities and tell them everything. But what would I say? That there's a monster in the Black Hills, that it's killed people and is still out there. They'd think I was crazy. Hell, sometimes I think I'm crazy. But then I remember the bodies, the claw marks, the glowing eyes in the darkness. I remember the fear in Agnes's voice as she told me about losing her family, and I know deep in my bones that it's all real. I've tried to warn people in my own subtle ways. When I overhear someone at the local diner talking about camping in the Black Hills, I'll casually mention that I've heard it can be dangerous out there. Most people brush it off. They think I'm just an old man worried about bears or getting lost. If only they knew the truth. There have been more disappearances over the years. Every now and then, I'll see a news story about a hiker gone missing in the Black Hills, or a camper who never returned from their trip. The authorities always chalk it up to accidents or animal attacks. But I know better. I can picture those poor souls running through the dark forest, the creature hot on their heels. I've thought about writing a book, telling my story to the world, but who would believe me? And more importantly, would it do any good? Or would it just draw more thrill seekers to the area, more potential victims for the creature? So I keep my story to myself, carrying the weight of what I know, what I've seen. It's a lonely existence sometimes, living with a truth that no one else believes. But in a way I feel responsible. As one of the few people who have encountered the creature and lived to tell about it, I feel a duty to remember, to stay vigilant. Because I know that somewhere out there, in the deep dark forests of the Black Hills, the creature is still roaming, still hunting, still waiting, and as long as it's out there, no one who ventures into those woods is truly safe. Now when I look at the night sky and see the stars twinkling above, I no longer feel the sense of peace and wonder I once did. Instead, I think of those glowing eyes in the darkness, and I shudder. The vastness of the universe which once filled me with awe now serves as a reminder of how small and vulnerable we really are. There are things out there in the darkness, things beyond our understanding, and sometimes, if we're not careful, we stumble upon them. And when we do, our lives are never the same again. So if you're ever in the Black Hills, and you hear a rustle in the bushes, or see a shadow move in a way that shadows shouldn't, don't dismiss it. Don't try to rationalize it away. Run. Run as fast and as far as you can, because it might just save your life. As for me, I'll stay here in my small town, watching the news for stories of missing hikers and campers, always wondering if the creature has claimed another victim. And at night, when the wind howls and the shadows grow long, I'll sit by my window, staring out into the darkness, remembering, because some things once seen can never be unseen. And some experiences, no matter how much we might wish to, can never be forgotten. The creature in the Black Hills is real. I know because I've seen it. I've run from it. I've survived it. And as long as I live, I'll carry the memory of that night with me. A reminder that the world is bigger, stranger, and far more dangerous than we could ever imagine. And somewhere out there, in the deep dark woods, the creature waits, watching, hunting, remembering, always remembering. The cold metal of my rifle pressed against my back as I made my way through the dense undergrowth of the Olympic National Forest. The canopy above was so thick that only slivers of moonlight pierced through, casting eerie shadows that danced across the forest floor. My name is Reuben Dyer, and for the past 6 years I've been part of a covert government unit that deals with creatures most people believe exist only in nightmares and folklore. Before joining this unit, I'd spent a decade in military special operations, followed by a stint in high-risk private security. I thought I'd seen it all, faced every kind of danger a man could face. But nothing, not the scorching deserts of the Middle East, not the treacherous mountain passes of Afghanistan, not even the cutthroat world of corporate espionage, had prepared me for the horrors I've witnessed in this job. Our unit operates under the radar, and for good reason. The things we hunt aren't the kind you talk about over dinner. They're the monsters that lurk in the shadows, the creatures that go bump in the night. And trust me, they're far more terrifying than anything your imagination can conjure. This latest assignment had brought us to the backwoods of Washington State. For months, rumors had been circulating about a series of brutal killings. Officially, it was written off as animal attacks, maybe a rogue bear or a particularly aggressive mountain lion. But the authorities knew better. That's where we came in. As I pushed through a particularly thick patch of ferns, I caught sight of Hank, our team's grizzled veteran. He was crouched low, examining something on the forest floor. Hank had been doing this job longer than anyone else on the team. Hell, longer than most people in our entire organization. He didn't say much, but when he did, you listened. "What have you got, Hank?" I whispered, careful not to disturb the unnatural quiet of the forest. Hank looked up at me, his weathered face creased with concern. "Tracks," he muttered, gesturing to the ground. Like nothing I've ever seen before. I knelt beside him, my eyes struggling to make out what he was seeing in the dim light. Then I saw it, a massive footprint, easily twice the size of a human's, with long curved claw marks etched deep into the soft earth. "Jesus," I breathed, feeling a chill run down my spine despite the warm night air. Hank nodded grimly. "Whatever made this, it's big, and it's close." As if on cue, a twig snapped somewhere in the darkness behind us. We both whirled around, weapons at the ready, but there was nothing there, just more trees and shadows. "We should regroup with the others," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Hank nodded in agreement, and we began making our way back to where we'd left the rest of our team. Our group for this mission was a mix of veterans and rookies. Besides Hank and myself, there was Jess, a former FBI profiler with a knack for tracking that bordered on supernatural. Then there were the new guys, Gabe and Wyatt, fresh out of whatever shadowy training program our organization ran. They were green, jumping at every snap of a twig, but they had potential. We found them gathered around a small clearing, tension evident in their postures. Jess was poring over a map spread out on a fallen log, while Gabe and Wyatt kept watch, their eyes darting nervously between the trees. "Find anything?" Jess asked as we approached, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, gesturing for everyone to gather closer. "Tracks," I said. "Big ones. Whatever we're dealing with, it's not your average predator." Jess's eyes narrowed. "I've been going over the reports of the attacks. The victims, they weren't just killed. They were torn apart, like something was feeding on them." I saw Gabe blanch at her words, and even Wyatt looked a little green around the gills. I couldn't blame them. This job had a way of showing you the darkest aspects of nature, and sometimes things that defied nature altogether. "All right, listen up," I said, taking charge of the situation. "We're going to set up base at the old ranger station about a mile north of here. It's defensible, and it'll give us a good vantage point to plan our next move. We move in pairs, eyes and ears open. Whatever's out there, it knows these woods better than we do. Stay alert." As we gathered our gear and prepared to move out, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest around us seemed to press in, the darkness between the trees hiding untold dangers. I'd been on countless missions like this before, but something about this one felt different. There was a weight to the air, a sense of ancient primal fear that set my teeth on edge. Little did I know, as we set off towards the ranger station, that we were walking into a nightmare beyond anything we could have imagined. The hunt had begun, but we were no longer the hunters, we were the prey. The old ranger station loomed before us, a dilapidated wooden structure that seemed to sag under the weight of the surrounding forest. As we approached, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into the maw of some ancient slumbering beast. "All right, let's secure the perimeter," I ordered, my voice barely above a whisper. "Jess, you're with me. We'll take the inside. Hank, you and the rookies check the grounds." The floorboards creaked ominously as Jess and I entered the station, our flashlights cutting through the gloom. Dust motes danced in the beams, and the musty smell of abandonment filled our nostrils. "This place has seen better days," Jess muttered, her eyes scanning the room. I nodded, moving towards a cluttered desk in the corner. "Let's see if we can find anything useful." As we rummaged through old logbooks and weather reports, a chill ran down my spine. Something about this place felt wrong, like we were disturbing something that should have been left alone. Suddenly, Jess froze. "Reuben," she whispered, "look at this." She was holding a yellowed newspaper clipping, dated nearly 50 years ago. The headline read, "Missing hiker's case remains unsolved." It's been happening for decades, I realized, a knot forming in my stomach. Before we could discuss it further, Hank's gruff voice crackled over our radios. "You two better get out here. We've found something." We rushed outside to find Hank and the rookies gathered around a large tree at the edge of the clearing. As we got closer, I saw what had caught their attention. Deep, jagged claw marks scored into the bark easily 8 feet off the ground. "Jesus," Gabe breathed, his face pale in the moonlight. "Whatever made these," Hank said grimly, "it's big, and it's marking its territory." A heavy silence fell over the group as the reality of our situation sank in. We were dealing with something far more dangerous than we had anticipated. "We need to set up surveillance," I decided. "Cameras, motion sensors, the works. If this thing comes back, we need to be ready." The next few hours were a flurry of activity as we fortified our position. By the time dawn broke, the ranger station had been transformed into a high-tech command center. Screens flickered with live feeds from cameras hidden throughout the surrounding forest, and a web of sensors created an invisible perimeter around our base. As the others caught some much-needed rest, I sat at the main console, my eyes glued to the monitors. The forest looked peaceful in the early morning light, but I knew better. Something was out there, watching, waiting. Days passed with no sign of our quarry. The tension was palpable, fraying nerves and shortening tempers. Gabe and Wyatt spent their time cleaning their weapons obsessively, while Hank pored over topographical maps, searching for any clue that might lead us to our prey. It was on the 4th day that things began to unravel. Jess had picked up a trail, something faint but promising. We found ourselves at the edge of a steep ravine, the ground soft and muddy beneath our feet. "The tracks are deep," Jess murmured, crouched over a series of impressions in the earth. "Whatever it is, it's massive." But there was something else, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The tracks ended abruptly at the edge of the ravine, as if the creature had simply vanished into thin air. "It's messing with us," Hank growled, his eyes scanning the tree line. We spread out, moving cautiously through the undergrowth. The forest was eerily quiet, the usual chorus of birds and insects conspicuously absent. I kept my rifle close, finger resting lightly on the trigger. That's when we heard it, a blood-curdling scream that shattered the silence like a gunshot. We spun around to see Gabe crumpled on the ground, blood pouring from a gash in his throat. Wyatt stood frozen, his eyes wide with terror as something massive and dark darted through the underbrush. I fired instinctively, the rapport of my rifle echoing through the trees. But the creature was gone, vanishing into the dense foliage as quickly as it had appeared. Hank was at Gabe's side in an instant, trying desperately to staunch the bleeding, but it was too late. The young agent's eyes stared sightlessly at the canopy above, his face frozen in a mask of terror. "What the hell was that?" Jess hissed, her voice trembling. "It's playing with us," Hank said grimly, wiping blood from his hands. "That thing is smarter than we gave it credit for." We retreated to the ranger station, our spirits broken and our nerves shattered. As we barricaded the doors and windows, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were no longer the hunters. We had become the hunted. Night fell, bringing with it a suffocating darkness that seemed to press in on us from all sides. The ranger station, once our refuge, now felt like a cage. It started with a low, vibrating hum that resonated through the walls. A sound unlike anything I'd ever heard before, deep and primal, making my teeth ache and my heart race. "It's here," Hank whispered, his face ashen in the dim light of our monitors. The attack came swiftly and without mercy. The door exploded inward in a shower of splinters, and there it was, a nightmare made flesh. The creature was massive, easily 7 feet tall, with a body that seemed to be a patchwork of different animals. Thick, sinewy limbs covered in coarse black fur ended in razor-sharp claws. Its maw was lined with jagged teeth like rows of serrated knives, but it was the eyes that truly chilled me to my core. Glowing orbs that radiated a malevolent intelligence. It lunged at Hank first, moving with a speed that defied its size. He fired point blank, the bullets tearing into its flesh, but it barely slowed. With one swipe of its massive paw, it sent Hank crashing into the wall, leaving a smear of blood in his wake. Jess was next, emptying her clip into the beast's side. For a moment I dared to hope it might be enough, but then it turned on her, jaws snapping shut around her arm with a sickening crunch. Her scream of agony was cut short as it tore into her, ripping flesh from bone with savage efficiency. I grabbed the shotgun, our last line of defense, and fired. The blast caught the creature in the head, staggering it momentarily. But it wasn't enough. With a roar that shook the very foundations of the station, it charged at me. I fired again, aiming for its chest. The creature swayed, its glowing eyes rolling back in its head, before it finally crumpled to the ground. For a long moment I stood there, shotgun trained on its still form, hardly daring to breathe. When I was finally certain it wasn't getting back up, I turned to my fallen comrades. Jess was barely clinging to life, blood pooling around her mangled body. Hank was slumped against the wall, his breathing ragged and labored. Wyatt was nowhere to be seen, likely taken during our retreat to the station. With shaking hands I radioed for extraction, my voice cracking as I relayed our coordinates. It felt like an eternity before I heard the distant thrum of helicopter rotors. As the medical team rushed Jess and Hank to safety, I stayed behind, watching as another team carefully loaded the creature's body into a containment unit. Unlike other cryptids we'd encountered, this one didn't fade away or dissolve into nothingness. It remained solid, real, undeniable proof of the nightmare we'd endured. Months have passed since that fateful night in the Olympic National Forest. Jess and Hank survived, barely, but they'll never be the same. The physical scars will heal, but the memory will haunt us forever. The creature, whatever it was, is now locked away in some top-secret facility, being studied by scientists who probably don't fully grasp the danger they're dealing with. Part of me hopes they'll find a way to prevent something like this from happening again. Another part dreads what other horrors their research might uncover. As for me, I'm still with the unit. Someone has to do this job, to stand between the darkness and the unsuspecting world. But now, every time I step into a forest or hear an unexplained noise in the night, I can't help but wonder, what else is out there waiting to be found? The real horror isn't the creatures we hunt. It's the knowledge that there are more out there, hidden in the shadows of our world. And someday, we might meet something we can't stop. But that's a problem for another day. For now, I'll keep doing what I do best, hunting the things that hunt us. Because in this line of work, you never know which mission might be your last. The crisp autumn air nipped at my face as I hiked through the towering pines of the Nicolet National Forest in northern Wisconsin. Golden leaves crunched under my boots with each step. I had been a park ranger for over a decade now, serving in parks and forests across the country, from the hardwood forests of Pennsylvania to the temperate rainforests of Oregon. But something about these deep northern woods always unsettled me. "You doing okay there, Jake?" asked my fellow ranger Mike, glancing over his shoulder at me. "You seem a bit on edge." I forced a smile. "Yeah, I'm all right. Just, this forest gives me the creeps sometimes, you know? All the stories and rumors." Mike chuckled. "What, you don't actually believe those old native legends, do you? About the bizarre creatures that supposedly lurk in these woods?" I shrugged. "I don't know what to believe anymore. After all my years as a ranger, I've seen and heard some strange things out there that I can't quite explain." We continued hiking in silence for a while. The sun began to set, bathing the forest in an eerie orange glow. Shadows lengthened, and an owl hooted mournfully in the distance. I was about to suggest we turn back and head to the ranger station when Mike froze. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I stood completely still, straining my ears. At first, all I could hear was the soft sigh of the wind through the pines. But then from somewhere deep in the forest came a sound that made my blood run cold. A long, agonized wail that sounded almost human, but not quite. It rose in pitch and volume until it became a deafening shriek, then cut off abruptly. Mike and I looked at each other, eyes wide. "What the hell was that?" he said, his voice shaking slightly. Before I could respond, a twig snapped loudly behind us. We both whirled around, pulling out our flashlights. The beams cut through the gathering darkness, illuminating the trees. At first, I didn't see anything. Then, about 30 yards away, I caught a glimpse of something. A pale figure darting between the trees, too fast for me to make out clearly. But I could have sworn it moved on all fours. "Mike, look," I shouted, pointing with my flashlight. But as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished into the shadows. Mike swallowed hard. "Okay, maybe those tribal elders we talked to weren't just trying to scare us with their stories. You saw that too, right?" I nodded slowly. "Yeah, I did. We need to be careful." We continued cautiously through the darkening forest, jumping at every noise, flashlights sweeping the trees. It was fully night now, with only a sliver of moon peeking through the branches. Suddenly, Mike's radio crackled to life, making us both flinch. "All units, we have a report of a missing hiker, last seen near your location," dispatch reported. "Please be on the lookout." We exchanged a grim look. Missing hikers were all too common in these remote stretches of wilderness. But with the disturbing things we had just seen and heard, this felt different, more ominous. As if on cue, another blood-curdling wail split the night, closer this time. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there was hunting, and we were the prey. "We need to find that hiker fast," I said, "and then get the hell out of this forest." Mike nodded in agreement, his face pale. Gripping our flashlights with sweaty hands, we forged ahead into the hungry darkness, dreading what we might find, or what might find us. The narrow beams of our flashlights felt pitifully inadequate against the oppressive blackness that closed in around us as we moved deeper into the forest. My heart pounded in my chest and my breaths came fast and ragged. Every rustle of leaves or skittering of some small animal made me jump. "Hello? Is anyone out there?" Mike called out periodically. "This is the Park Service. We're here to help." His voice seemed to be swallowed up by the heavy silence almost as soon as the words left his mouth. A small, paranoid part of my mind wondered if we were doing more harm than good by announcing our presence so loudly and clearly. If this missing hiker had run afoul of something unnatural, would we simply be drawing its attention as well? I shook my head, trying to dispel these dark, irrational thoughts. We were trained professionals. Whatever was going on, we could handle it. But I couldn't quite convince myself. "Jake, over here," Mike said suddenly. "I found something." I hurried over to where he stood at the base of a large oak tree. He pointed his flashlight at the ground. There, illuminated in the stark white LED light, was a hiking boot. It was caked in dried mud and lay on its side as if it had been tossed there carelessly. About 10 feet away was its mate. A scrap of torn, blood-stained fabric that looked like it might have been part of a shirt fluttered from a nearby sapling. My throat tightened with dread. This was looking more and more like a crime scene, not a simple lost hiker case. I pulled out my radio to update dispatch on our grim discovery, but only got a hiss of static. The signal was being blocked by something. "Looks like we're on our own out here," I said grimly, putting the useless radio away. We scanned the area, looking for any other clues, any hint to the hiker's whereabouts or fate, but the forest kept its secrets. As I crouched to examine a patch of flattened, bloody leaves, a soft noise made me freeze. It sounded like footsteps, the slow, furtive steps of something trying to move quietly but not quite succeeding, and it was getting closer. I stood up slowly, gripping my flashlight so tightly my knuckles turned white. Mike moved to stand back to back with me, his breath coming in short, frightened puffs. The footsteps grew louder, twigs cracking, from multiple directions now, surrounding us. "Show yourself," I shouted, hating the quaver in my voice. Silence. The steps had stopped. For a few endless seconds, the only sound was the thundering of blood in my ears. Then the shrieks began. Hideous, inhuman howls tearing through the night from all sides, ringing with a disturbing note of twisted glee, as if delighted by our terror. Through the trees, I caught flashes of pale, lurching forms, vaguely humanoid, but moving with a grotesque, disjointed gait. "Run," I screamed. "Run." Blind with panic, we crashed through the underbrush. Thorns tearing at our clothes, branches whipping our faces. The shrieks and wails from the horrors behind us grew louder, spurring us on. I risked a glance over my shoulder and instantly regretted it. The things chasing us were clearly visible now, illuminated by our dancing, flickering flashlights. They were human, but not. Their limbs were too long, their faces distorted into leering skull-like masks, their eyes sunk in pits of darkness. And they were fast, far faster than us, gaining ground with each passing second. "We'll never outrun them," Mike gasped out, his voice edged with desperation. "The river," I panted. "Maybe we can lose them at the river." I prayed I was remembering the map of the area correctly, that there was a deep, fast-moving river carving through the forest nearby. We veered left, following the downward slope of the land, legs pumping, chests heaving. The shrieks behind us took on a note of frenzied bloodlust. I could swear I felt cold, grasping fingers brushing the back of my neck. And then, there it was, a ribbon of black, churning water cutting through the trees up ahead. With a final burst of energy born of pure terror, we sprinted toward it. At the bank, we leapt out over the water without hesitation. The shock of the icy water knocked the breath from my lungs as I plunged beneath the surface. The current seized me instantly, tumbling me head over heels. I fought my way back to the surface, gasping and spluttering. A few feet away, I saw Mike's head break the surface as well. Behind us, at the edge of the river, our pursuers milled about, screaming in fury. They paced back and forth but seemed unable or unwilling to enter the water. The river swept us swiftly downstream and around a bend, the horrifying wails fading into the night. Exhausted and battered, we dragged ourselves ashore on a rocky outcropping a good half-mile from where we had jumped in. For a long time we just lay there, chests heaving, not saying a word. The forest was deathly quiet. Finally, I pushed myself to a sitting position with a groan. What the hell were those things, Jake?" Mike asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "They weren't human. They couldn't have been." I just shook my head, at a loss for words. My mind reeled, trying to process the sheer impossibility of what we had just experienced. "I don't know, Mike," I said finally. "But whatever they are, we're not even close to being equipped to deal with them. We need to get back to the station, regroup, and call for help." He nodded jerkily and started to get to his feet. Then he froze, eyes widening with horror at something over my shoulder. "Jake, behind you." I started to turn, a new fear gripping my heart. The last thing I saw before a stunning blow to the back of my head plunged me into darkness was a looming, emaciated figure with eyes like bottomless pits. Then, nothing. Consciousness returned slowly, in throbbing, pain-soaked fragments. The first thing I became aware of was the cold, damp ground beneath me. Rough stones scraped my cheek. Next was the musty, rotting smell that filled my nostrils, underlaid with a coppery tang that could only be blood. Finally, I registered the dim, flickering light, casting distorted shadows on what seemed to be jagged cavern walls rising up on either side of me. I jerked upright with a gasp, then immediately pressed my hands to my pounding skull. Memories crashed over me. The missing hiker. The pale monstrosities chasing us, leaping into the river. And then, something attacking me from behind. "Mike?" I called out hoarsely, my voice echoing in the enclosed space. "Mike, are you there?" No response. Fighting down rising panic, I struggled to my feet, swaying dangerously until the dizziness passed. In the feeble light of a few guttering torches wedged into crevices in the cavern walls, I tried to get my bearings. I appeared to be in some kind of tunnel, with no immediately evident way out. The rock walls were slick with moisture and crawling with pale worms and beetles. Claw marks gouged into the stone gave the disturbing impression of hundreds of desperate hands scrabbling for purchase. As my eyes adjusted, I saw that the tunnel branched off in several different directions at the far end, each dark maw promising only more fear and disorientation. The one directly ahead of me sloped downwards at a steep angle, descending deeper into the earth. A foul breeze drifted up from it, carrying a stomach-churning stench of decay and a sibilant whisper that might have been the rush of an unseen river or something else. Steeling myself, I checked my pockets, taking inventory. My flashlight was gone, either lost in the river or taken by whatever brought me here. My radio, compass, and weapon were missing as well. Dread quickly built into full-blown terror as the reality of my situation sank in. I was alone, unarmed, with no way to call for help, in some kind of underground labyrinth populated by unnatural horrors. For a moment I almost succumbed to the black despair rising up to drown me. What chance did I possibly have of surviving this, much less saving Mike and the lost hiker? Then, from somewhere deep inside, a small ember of determination flared to life. I was a park ranger, damn it. I had dedicated my life to protecting people in the wild places I loved, and I wasn't about to quit now. Dire circumstances be damned. I would find a way out of this nightmare, or die trying. Squaring my shoulders, I began exploring the first side tunnel entrance, hugging the dank wall, straining my eyes in the murk. The passage twisted and turned, leading me on an aimless, meandering path. Here and there, small chambers branched off but revealed nothing of use. No sign of Mike, the hiker, or a way out. Occasionally, I glimpsed shadowy shapes flitting along the edges of the torchlight, chittering and scurrying just out of sight. I tried not to think about what they might be. After what felt like hours of blind wandering, I stumbled out into a larger cavern. Raising my eyes from my careful study of the uneven ground, I felt my breath catch in my throat. There, stacked against the far wall, were piles of hiking gear, backpacks, boots, coils of rope, dented cookware, and among the jumbled equipment gleamed the unmistakable white of human bones. Bile burned the back of my throat as the scene came into nightmarish focus. Scraps of tattered, stained clothing still clung to some of the skeletons. A sun-bleached backpack had a smiling family photo pinned to it. These were the lost hikers, at least a dozen of them. Men, women, even a few that looked child-sized. And from the varying states of decay and the layer of dust coating everything, this dank charnel house had been accumulating its grim trophies for quite some time. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the horrific sight, but the image was seared into my mind. Those skeletons weren't just anonymous remains. Each one represented a real person, who had suffered and died in this forsaken place, alone and terrified, just like I would if I couldn't find a way out. A skittering noise behind me shattered my paralysis. I whirled to see a pale, emaciated figure crouched in the tunnel I had just traversed, watching me with dark, hollow eyes. My gorge rose. The thing had once been human, but starvation and unimaginable cruelties had transformed it into a feral, malformed wretch, more animal than man. "Stay back," I warned, trying to inject some authority into my faltering voice. "I'm with the Park Service. I want to help you." The creature cocked its head to the side, considering. For a moment, it almost seemed like a spark of human intelligence flickered in those fathomless eyes. Then it opened its mouth unnaturally wide and let out a gurgling shriek, exposing jagged shards of teeth and a lolling black tongue. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. In a blind panic, I turned and fled down a random tunnel, the creature's wails chasing me into the darkness. My heart pounded in my chest as I ran blindly through the twisting, disorienting tunnels, my ragged breaths tearing at my lungs. Behind me, I could hear the scrabbling and howling of the aberrant humanoid creature giving chase, along with other shrieks and chittering echoing through the caverns, a terrifying cacophony of predatory glee that grew louder with each passing second. I had no idea where I was going, turning corners at random, splashing through icy subterranean streams, stumbling and clawing my way over heaps of rubble and down narrow passages. My hands were scraped raw and bloody from grasping at the rough stone, and I had lost all sense of direction in my primal need to get away. Just as I felt my strength starting to flag, my legs turning to jelly beneath me, I burst out into a larger cavern and skidded to a halt, stunned by what I saw. The chamber was lit by an eerie phosphorescent glow emanating from clumps of pale fungus clinging to the walls and ceiling, and in that unsettling light, I beheld a sight that stopped my heart. In the center of the cavern lay an enormous heap of bones, not the cleanly picked remains I had seen before, but fresher kills, the viscera and sinew still clinging to them, congealing into a gory paste on the damp stone floor. A vile stench of rot hung thick in the air, but most horrifying of all were the figures crouched around this repellent feast, ripping and tearing at the meat, gurgling and growling. At first, my stunned mind tried to convince itself that I was seeing a pack of hyenas or some other scavenging animal, but hyenas didn't have pale, almost translucent skin hanging from the bones, or weirdly elongated limbs that bent at unnatural angles, and they certainly didn't have those horrible, distorted faces with gaping mouths and large, night-black eyes that gleamed with a sick intelligence as they swiveled to stare at me. Time seemed to freeze as I stood there, my mind trying and failing to process the nightmare tableau before me. The creatures remained motionless as well, in a moment of mutual shocked paralysis. Then, as one, they rose from their grisly meal, bloody claws flexing, lipless mouths peeling back to reveal rows of jagged teeth, and started shambling toward me. Unfrozen into action by pure animal terror, I spun and sprinted for the nearest tunnel opening, just as a cacophony of eager shrieks and howls erupted behind me. I could hear the freakish beings giving chase, their uneven footsteps and excited panting echoing off the narrow cavern walls as I fled in blind panic. I ran until my lungs seared and my muscles screamed in protest, taking wild, careening turns, propelled forward only by the desperate need to escape the horrors snapping at my heels. At one point, I felt rank breath and sharp claws graze the back of my neck before I put on a final burst of speed and lost my pursuer in the labyrinthine tunnels. Finally, after an eternity of gasping for air and pushing my battered body to its limits, I staggered out into a small chamber and collapsed against the clammy wall, chest heaving. I could no longer hear any signs of pursuit, and allowed myself a moment to catch my breath and attempt to collect my fractured thoughts. It was clear to me now, even through the haze of exhaustion and horror, that this was no ordinary threat I was facing. The things inhabiting these caverns, whatever they were, went far beyond the human serial killer, or even rabid animal my ranger training had prepared me for. These were creatures out of mankind's most primal nightmares, the living embodiment of the fear that had caused our ancestors to huddle close to the campfire and pray the night would pass quickly. Was this what had happened to Mike and the other hikers? Dragged down into this dank labyrinth to be sport for these horrifying entities? The bones I had seen piled in that chamber like so much refuse seemed to confirm it. But why was I still alive? Why hadn't they killed me yet? During the countless opportunities they had to overtake me in these tunnels where they clearly held every advantage. The thought arose, terrible in its implications, that perhaps something far worse than a quick death awaited me. Some darker fate that involved being kept alive, at least for a time. I shuddered, bile rising in my throat again. I knew with grim certainty that I couldn't just keep stumbling around blindly in this hostile underworld. I needed a plan, a way to find Mike and any other survivors and get us all out. Forcing my leaden limbs to move, I started searching the small cavern I had ended up in, looking for anything I could use. To my surprise, I spotted a rusted metal lantern sitting in a crevice, along with a crumpled pack that looked like standard ranger gear. Hope flaring in my chest, I hurried over and snatched up my unexpected finds. The pack had definitely seen better days, its canvas exterior torn and filthy, but it contained a dented canteen with a bit of stale water, a coil of frayed rope, a handful of ancient-looking granola bars, and most valuable of all, a sparking flint to light the lantern with. Hands shaking with exhaustion and residual fear, I managed to coax the lantern wick to ignite, creating a much steadier light than the feeble, guttering flames of the torches. By its glow, I noticed a faded scrap of paper wedged into a crevice beneath where the lantern had rested. Tugging it free, I saw it was a torn, water-damaged page that appeared to have been ripped from an old leather-bound journal. The fragment was covered in a spidery, barely legible scrawl, made even harder to decipher by water stains and what looked disturbingly like old blood stains, but I could just make out a few scattered phrases. The old stories are true. Beings older than mankind live in the deep caves, come up to hunt, lure the unwary into their domain, worship some dark power, an ancient evil. The words sent a chill through me, even though they revealed little I hadn't already guessed. Folding the scrap carefully, I placed it in my pocket, unsure if it would be of any use but unwilling to leave it behind. Trying to ignore my aching muscles and gnawing hunger, I hoisted the pack and held the lantern high. The thought of deliberately descending deeper into the earth, into the lair of those abominations, made my legs tremble with dread. But if there was even a chance Mike was still alive down there, I had no choice. Squaring my shoulders and taking a deep, shuddering breath, I started down a tunnel that trended downward, into the hungry darkness that awaited me. The lantern cast a feeble pool of light ahead of me as I crept down the sloping, narrow passageway, jumping at every flicker of shadow. The air grew increasingly dank and oppressive the deeper I went, like a physical weight pressing down on me. I tried to keep my breathing shallow and quiet, not wanting to alert any of the tunnel's murderous denizens to my presence. At the same time, I strained my ears for any sounds that might indicate Mike or the missing hiker were nearby. Perhaps a moan of pain or a cry for help, but the only noises were the incessant drip of water and the occasional skittering of unseen creatures in the darkness. Each step I took required a monumental effort of will, every instinct screaming at me to turn and flee back the way I had come. But I pressed on. After descending for what felt like miles through countless twists and junctions in the tunnels, I stepped out into a massive cavern, so vast that my little lantern couldn't illuminate the far walls. I paused, trying to get my bearings in the echoing space. Then I noticed that the cavern wasn't pitch black like the tunnels had been. A dim, sickly green luminescence seemed to emanate from the walls and ceiling, casting everything in an unsettling underwater hue. As my eyes adjusted, I realized with dawning horror that the walls were covered in some sort of pulsing, semi-translucent slime, within which squirmed and undulated thousands of tiny larval creatures. They wriggled obscenely, pressing against the membranous surface as if trying to break free. The source of the eerie glow was unclear. Perhaps some bioluminescent property of the repulsive organisms or the mucus itself. Fighting down a surge of revulsion, I made my way cautiously into the immense chamber, senses straining. I hadn't gone more than a dozen steps when I noticed a series of stone outcroppings emerging from the cavern floor ahead of me, forming crude dais. And on these raised platforms, to my horror, crouched more of the ghoulish beings I had seen feasting earlier. They perched perfectly motionless, their elongated limbs folded beneath them, reminding me of mantises or some sort of awful insects waiting to spring on their prey. Their bulbous eyes glinted coldly in the directions of the various tunnel entrances to the great cavern, including my own. I froze, barely daring to breathe, an icy wave of terror crashing over me. Had they seen me yet? Just as I was about to edge slowly back the way I had come, there was a stirring from a platform in the center of the cavern, the largest of the bunch. A hunched, emaciated figure rose from the shadows there, and I felt the bile rise in my throat. While the other creatures were horrific enough, this monstrosity was of another level entirely. Its body seemed to be composed more of shadow than substance, a gaunt, fleshless frame that shifted and flickered at the edges as if not quite solid. Tattered remnants of clothing hung from its stick-like limbs, but worst of all was the face, little more than a grinning skull, with only scraps of rotting flesh clinging to it, and eyes that burned with a poisonous green fire in their sunken sockets. The being raised its skeletal arms in a gesture that almost looked like supplication, and spoke in a rasping, sibilant voice that scuttered obscenely along my skin and set my teeth on edge.
Hashtu mogla ashkanath, fitagan warol ye?
The words, if that's what they were, emerged not from the thing's lipless mouth but rather reverberated from all around, as if the very air of the cavern was given loathsome voice. At this hideous utterance, the other creatures began to stir and chitter, a rising tide of agitation. I had no idea what the words meant, but they filled me with a primal, bone-deep dread, an instinctive knowledge that I was witnessing something profane and blasphemous, that had no place in a sane world. I began to back away, no longer caring about stealth, desperate to put as much distance as I could between myself and the ghastly scene playing out before me. But then a flicker of movement on a smaller dais near the back of the cavern caught my eye. At first I thought it was just another one of the lurking horrors, but then I caught a flash of fabric, a very human groan of pain. My heart leaped to my throat. It was Mike, and from the looks of it the missing hiker too, both tied to the stone platform with what appeared to be slimy, pulsating ropes of the same nauseating organic material that coated the cavern walls. They both appeared to be unconscious or barely conscious, their heads lolling to the side, and crouched over them. A long, serrated blade of some dark metal clutched in its bony claws was another one of the most twisted and deformed of the creatures. Like a high priest of this macabre ceremony, I knew with complete terrifying certainty that I was about to witness a human sacrifice to whatever unspeakable forces these freakish entities served, and that I was utterly powerless to stop it. Even as my mind screamed at me to flee, I found myself rooted to the spot, unable to wrench my gaze away. The cavern fell silent, every unclean eye fixed on the tableau before us. The priest raised the jagged knife high, and I squeezed my eyes shut, mumbling a prayer to any god that would listen, knowing no salvation would be forthcoming. I braced myself for my friend's dying screams, but they never came. Instead, a sound that I can only describe as a roar of terrible otherworldly fury echoed through the cavern, shaking the very stone beneath my feet. My eyes flew open again to see the most extraordinary and terrifying sight I have ever beheld. Standing at another entrance to the vast chamber, eyes blazing and a dull red light glowing from beneath its skin as if its veins ran with fire, was an old Native American man. His grizzled features were contorted with incongruous rage and what looked like disgust as he glared at the gathered abominations. He began to chant, the words an ominous rising cadence that sparked some deep ancestral memory. As the sonorous words rolled through the cavern, a brilliant flash of red illuminated the dank space, blinding after the eerie green glow. It coalesced into intricate twisting symbols that seared themselves into the air before the old man like a fiery sigil. He thrust his gnarled staff toward the floating runes, shouting a word that sounded like Begon, but reverberated on a level beyond language. At this unmistakable banishment, the uncanny light intensified into an unbearable brightness, the symbols exploding outward to fill the chamber. The fiendish creatures began to screech and wail in a cacophony of anguish and rage. They writhed and contorted grotesquely as the glare consumed them, their misshapen forms unraveling like shadows under the noonday sun. And then, between one blink of my tearing eyes and the next, they were simply gone, leaving no trace that they had ever existed. Silence reigned in the now empty cavern, the last echoes of those horrible shrieks still ringing in my ears. My legs finally gave out beneath me, and I slumped to the cold stone floor, staring in uncomprehending wonder and residual terror at the old man who now seemed to be the only other living soul in that accursed place. He, in turn, fixed me with an unfathomable gaze, a look that somehow managed to convey grief, weariness, and something like recognition all at once. I was almost too late, he pronounced in a voice roughened by age and sorrow. They nearly opened the way for the Ancient Ones to return. We were lucky this time. Somehow, impossibly, I found my voice. Who, what, were those things? What just happened? He shook his head slowly. Pray you never have to truly know. They are abominations that have existed in the dark corners of the world since before mankind dreamed of fire. There are some doors that must remain closed, some powers that must not be awakened, for all our sakes. With that, he turned and began to walk stooped and slow toward the platforms where Mike and the hiker remained. Still reeling, I clambered to my feet and stumbled after him, a million questions whirling in my stunned mind. I could only hope that with this inexplicable reprieve I would have the chance to ask them. But for now, getting my fellow rangers to safety was all that mattered. The horrors both witnessed and implied could wait until we were far from this subterranean hell and back under the clean light of day. If indeed such a place still existed unchanged after all I had seen. The nightmares I knew would be with me always, but perhaps also a grim wisdom that there are far fouler things lurking in the shadows of the world than anything I had ever imagined, and that sometimes the only light that can banish them is a single flame of human courage and compassion against the darkness. With these thoughts echoing in my mind, I reached the platform and set to freeing Mike and the hiker with trembling hands. praying I had the strength to lead them out of this abyss, praying that the world above still made a kind of sense, knowing on some deep soul level that my own world would never be quite the same. Mike groaned as I gently shook his shoulder, trying to coax him back to consciousness. His eyelids fluttered, then snapped open, confusion and fear flooding his gaze as he tried to sit up, straining against his repulsive bonds. "Easy, Mike. It's me. Jake," I said soothingly. "I'm going to get you out of here, but I need you to stay calm, okay?" Recognition slowly dawned on his battered face. "Jake? What's going on? Where are we?" His eyes darted around the cavern, as if expecting the horrors to re-emerge from the shadows at any moment. I couldn't blame him. "I'm not entirely sure," I answered grimly, starting to cut through the spongy ropes with my pocket knife. They were tough and rubbery, resisting the blade. "But we're getting out now." As soon as he was free, I moved to the other platform to work on the missing hiker's bindings. He was in even worse shape than Mike, barely conscious, his breath coming in shallow, rapid pants. Dark bruises and half-healed lacerations marred nearly every inch of visible skin, and his clothes hung off him in filthy tatters. It was clear he had endured unimaginable torments at the hands of our captors. I felt a presence at my elbow and glanced over to see the old Native American man crouching beside me. Up close, his weathered face was even more striking, etched with deep lines that spoke of a long life filled with both wisdom and sorrow. His eyes, though, were the most arresting, black as obsidian and seeming to hold knowledge of things no mortal man should gaze upon. He reached out and laid a surprisingly strong hand on the injured hiker, muttering some words in a language I didn't recognize. The man stirred and let out a sigh, his breathing easing slightly. I looked at our strange savior in astonishment. He met my gaze levelly. "An old blessing," he explained, "to ease his suffering and give him strength for the journey ahead." "Journey?" I repeated, hope kindling in my chest. "You know the way out?" He nodded once. "These tunnels hold no secrets from me any longer, but we must move swiftly." His eyes flicked to the slime-covered walls, as if he could sense something beyond my perception. "The wardings I placed will not hold them back forever." A chill rippled down my spine at his words, and I redoubled my efforts to free the hiker. Between the two of us, we managed to get him off the dais and propped upright between us, his arms slung over our shoulders. Mike moved in to take some of the semi-conscious man's weight as well. As we began to make our way towards the tunnel, the old man indicated, our steps echoing in the unnatural silence left in the wake of the creature's destruction. As we walked, I tried to process everything that had happened, my mind reeling. The things I had seen, the horrors I had witnessed, felt like something out of a fever dream, not reality. And yet the evidence was all around me. The eldritch cavern, the rescued hiker's injuries, the haunted look in Mike's eyes that I was sure was mirrored in my own. I turned to our mysterious guide, questions burning on my tongue. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice seeming too loud in the oppressive stillness. "How did you find us? What were those things?" He was silent for a long moment, the only sound our labored breathing and the scuff of our footsteps on the stone. Then he began to speak, his voice low and mesmerizing. "My name is John Blackfeather," he said. "I am a shaman of the Ojibwe people, who have lived in these lands since the time before memory. The creatures you saw are known to us as the Wendigo Egg, dark spirits of insatiable hunger and cruelty. They have haunted the deep places of the earth for centuries, preying on the lost and the unwary." He paused, his expression distant, as if seeing into a past only he could perceive. "My people have long fought to keep their evil at bay, passing down the old ways, the rituals and wards to bind them, from generation to generation. But as time goes on, fewer and fewer believe in the old stories, until it is too late." A shudder passed through me at his words. To think such nightmares were real, not just myths and legends, was almost too much to bear. Seeming to sense my distress, John laid a comforting hand on my shoulder. "You have faced these abominations and survived," he said solemnly. "That is no small thing. You have a strength and courage within you that few possess." I shook my head, feeling anything but strong or courageous. All I felt was fear and an overwhelming desire to see the sun again. "I just want to get out of here," I said hoarsely. John nodded. "And so we shall. But know this. Your encounter with the Wendigo will leave a mark, seen and unseen. You have touched the edges of their dark realm, and that is not something easily forgotten or escaped." His ominous words sent a chill through me, despite the stuffy air of the tunnels. I had a feeling he was speaking from personal experience. What horrors had he witnessed? What battles had he fought, in his self-appointed role as guardian and guide through this underworld? I glanced over at Mike, seeing my own unease reflected in his eyes. The hiker between us remained mercifully oblivious, his head drooping to his chest. We had no choice but to trust in John Blackfeather to lead us out of this abyss, and pray that he knew what he was doing. We trudged on in silence through the winding stone passages, putting the ghastly green cavern further behind us with each step. Though I tried to keep track of the turnings in case we needed to retrace our path, I soon became hopelessly disoriented. The tunnels seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them, taking on a new configuration that seemed subtly, unsettlingly wrong. It was as if the geometry of this place didn't quite obey the normal laws of reality. After what felt like hours, days, a lifetime of endless dank corridors and passages, we finally emerged into a small chamber with a shaft of blessed daylight spilling down from a crack high above. I nearly wept at the sight. John helped us maneuver the injured hiker up through the narrow crevice first, Mike boosting him from below while I pulled from above. Then Mike clambered up himself, cursing and scraping his knees and elbows in his haste to escape the oppressive tunnels. I turned to help John, but he waved me off. "Go," he said, something deep and unfathomable in his eyes. "Get your friends to safety. I will follow in my own time." I hesitated, torn between my bone-deep need to flee this place and my reluctance to leave this mysterious old man who had saved us all. As if sensing my thoughts, he offered me a small, sad smile.
"Do not fear for me,"
he murmured. "I have walked in the darkness for longer than you can imagine, and I will continue to do so as long as I am needed. It is my burden and my privilege to stand against the hungry shadows so that others may live in the light." With those cryptic words, he turned and shuffled back down the tunnel, soon vanishing into the gloom. Despite the warmth of the sun on my face as I pulled myself up through the crack and out into the clean, bright air, a part of me remained in those dank passageways below, with John Blackfeather, guardian, guide, and enigma. I knew that I would never forget him, or the nightmares we had faced together in the caverns of the Wendigo. And though I longed to put this subterranean hell behind me and lose myself in the comforting normality of the surface world, his parting words lingered like a chill in my bones, for I had gazed into the abyss and witnessed the horrors that dwelled there. And I knew, with a terrible certainty, that my journey into the hungry darkness was far from over. The shadows would always be with me now, waiting, watching, whispering at the edges of my consciousness, calling me back to the endless tunnels and the abominations that lurked within. But for now, reunited with Mike and the hiker under the vault of blue sky, I let the sheer relief of survival wash over me. We had made it out alive, if not unscathed, and that would have to be enough, for now. As the adrenaline began to drain away, exhaustion and reaction took its place. My knees buckled and I sank to the carpet of pine needles, breathing deeply of the crisp, sap-scented air. Mike collapsed next to me, cradling his head and shaking hands. What the hell just happened?" he croaked, his voice cracking. "I don't know," I answered honestly, except that everything we thought we knew about the world, about what's possible, was wrong. I could still see the hideous contortions of the Wendigo, still hear their frenzied shrieks ringing in my ears. Mike looked up at me with haunted eyes. "How are we supposed to go back to our normal lives after this? Pretend like none of it happened?" I sighed deeply. "We can't, those things are still down there in the dark, along with who knows what else. And now we know they're real. So what do we do?" he asked helplessly. I looked out over the serene vista of the forest, now seeming to conceal unimaginable horrors beneath its placid exterior. John Blackfeather's ancient knowing gaze swam before my mind's eye. "We do what we've always done," I said slowly. "We watch over the wilderness, and we protect the people who venture into it, as best we can. Only now we know what we're really up against, what we're really fighting to keep at bay." I thought of all the missing hikers whose final fates I had never discovered, and suppressed a shudder. How many of them had been dragged down into that abyss, never to return? Their numbers would likely only grow, I knew, as more and more people pushed into the wild places, heedless of the dire warnings and eerie tales. But perhaps some would be spared that horrific end. Now that I knew the truth, now that I could recognize the signs and take precautions against the hungry ones that prowled the shadows, it wasn't much, set against the scope of the hidden evil that lurked below. But it was a start. If John Blackfeather and others like him had held the darkness at bay this long, then I could do no less than add my own light to that endless battle. For the sake of the lost and the innocent, I would stand watch. I would walk the forests and the deep places, ever vigilant, ever wary. I would be a keeper of the flame against the eternal night. As I pulled myself to my feet and reached down to help Mike up, I saw the same realization and resolve come into his eyes. He met my gaze and gave a single tight nod, a silent promise. Together we slung the unconscious hiker's arms over our shoulders once more and began the long hike back to civilization, to hospitals and incident reports and debriefings, and perhaps in time, to some semblance of normality. But a part of us would always remain in those dank tunnels with their chittering denizens. In that endless shadow realm where the Wendigo reigned. That knowledge, that grim burden, would never leave us. We had become brothers bound by blood, and by secrets, inductees into the dark mysteries that lay beneath the surface of the world. And that fellowship, I knew, would last a lifetime. As the trees closed in around us, and the mountains swallowed the sun, I felt a new purpose take root in my soul beside the fear and the echoes of old screams. I was a ranger, a guardian, a light in dark places, and I had work to do. My name is Arthur Williams. I find myself reflecting on a life that's been anything but ordinary. For the past 15 years, I've worked as a park ranger in the dense, mysterious forests of northern Idaho. It's a job that's brought me more joy, wonder, and yes, terror than I ever could have imagined. I suppose I should start at the beginning. I wasn't always a ranger. In my younger years, I worked in an office in Boise, pushing papers and dreaming of something more. It wasn't until my 52nd birthday that I decided to make a change. My wife Sarah had passed away a year earlier, and our children were grown with families of their own. I felt untethered, adrift in a life that no longer seemed to fit. It was during a camping trip in Clearwater National Forest that the idea struck me. I'd always loved the outdoors, and as I sat by my campfire listening to the whisper of wind through the pines and the distant call of a loon, I felt more at peace than I had in years. The next morning, I marched into the ranger station and asked about job openings. The transition wasn't easy. At my age, the physical demands of ranger training were challenging, to say the least. But I persevered, driven by a newfound sense of purpose. When I finally donned my uniform and ranger hat for the first time, I felt a pride I hadn't experienced in decades. Clearwater became my home, my sanctuary. I learned every trail, every stream, every rocky outcropping. I could identify dozens of bird calls, track animals through the underbrush, and navigate the forest in the darkest night. I thought I knew every secret these woods held. How wrong I was. It was in my 3rd year as a ranger that the incident occurred. The one that still haunts me, that makes me question everything I thought I knew about the natural world. It was 1998, a year that had started like any other, but would end up changing my life forever. The day it all began was unremarkable at first. It was early June, and we'd just come out of a week of heavy rain. I was assigned to check the lesser-known paths for storm damage, a routine task that I'd done countless times before. I woke before dawn, as was my habit. My small cabin on the edge of the forest was quiet, save for the gentle ticking of the old clock in the kitchen. I brewed a strong pot of coffee, its rich aroma filling the air as I prepared for the day ahead. As I sipped from my mug, I gazed out the window at the forest. The first hints of sunrise were just beginning to paint the sky, turning the sea of green treetops into a shadowy, undulating mass. I packed my gear methodically. First aid kit, trail maps, compass, radio, and of course my trusty rifle. We're required to carry firearms due to the wildlife, bears, mountain lions, and the like, though in all my years I'd rarely had cause to use mine. Still, it was a comforting weight at my side as I set out into the misty morning. The air was crisp and damp, heavy with the scent of wet earth and pine. As I made my way down the main trail, my boots squelched in the mud, leaving deep imprints that would soon be erased by the passage of animals or the next rainfall. I radioed in my position to base camp, my voice breaking the early morning stillness. "This is Ranger Williams. I'm heading out to check the eastern trails for storm damage. Over." The radio crackled with static before a voice responded. It was Marta, my colleague and friend. "Copy that, Arthur. Be careful out there. We've had reports of a few mudslides. Over. Will do, Marta. I'll check in every hour. Over and out. As I ventured deeper into the forest, the familiar sounds of the awakening woods surrounded me. Birdsong filled the air, a melodious chorus that I'd grown to love over the years. Squirrels chattered in the branches above, and somewhere in the distance, I heard the distinctive sound of a woodpecker hard at work. The first few hours of my patrol were uneventful. I found a few downed branches and noted areas where the trail had been partially washed out by the heavy rains, but nothing too serious. It wasn't until around noon that I began to notice something off. I had stopped by a small creek for my lunch break, sitting on a fallen log as I unwrapped the sandwich I'd packed. The burbling of the water and the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze created a peaceful backdrop. But as I sat there savoring my meal and sipping coffee from my thermos, I realized that something was missing. The birds had stopped singing. Now, to most people, this might not seem like much, but for someone who spends as much time in the woods as I do, it was jarring. The forest is never truly silent. There's always some ambient noise, be it wind or wildlife, but in that moment it was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. I set my sandwich down, suddenly alert. My eyes scanned the surrounding trees, searching for any sign of what might have caused this unusual silence. A predator, perhaps. But I saw nothing out of the ordinary. Just trees, undergrowth, and the quietly flowing creek. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease that had settled over me. "You're getting jumpy in your old age, Arthur," I muttered to myself, forcing a chuckle that sounded hollow even to my own ears. But as I packed up my lunch and continued on my way, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in the forest I thought I knew so well. The rest of the afternoon passed slowly. I found more storm damage, a few downed trees and a small landslide blocking one of the lesser-used trails. I made notes of their locations, planning to send a crew out to clear them in the coming days. But all the while I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was ridiculous, of course. I was alone in this part of the forest. No hikers ventured this far off the main trails, and my fellow rangers were patrolling other areas. Yet every so often, I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and find nothing there. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I found myself gripping my rifle a little tighter than usual. As the day wore on and the shadows began to lengthen, I knew I should start heading back, but something compelled me to push on, to explore just a little further. That's when I came across the old logging road. It wasn't on any of the official maps, but we rangers knew about it. It had been abandoned years ago, left to be reclaimed by the forest. Weeds pushed up through cracks in the weathered asphalt, and young saplings had taken root along its edges. I'd been down this road a few times before, but something about it looked different today. There were marks in the mud along its edges, not quite footprints, but long dragging impressions that I couldn't identify. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to follow the old road, just for a little while. The forest seemed to close in around me as I walked, the trees looming taller and the undergrowth growing thicker. The silence that had unsettled me earlier now seemed oppressive, broken only by the sound of my own footsteps and the occasional snap of a twig beneath my boots. That's when I saw it, a flicker of unnatural color through the trees. I moved closer, pushing aside branches, and found myself on the edge of a small clearing. In the center stood a tent, weather-beaten and sagging, its once bright fabric faded to a dull gray. A small fire pit sat nearby, the ashes within it still warm to the touch. My first thought was that it must be an illegal campsite. We occasionally had issues with people setting up camp in restricted areas, but something about this site felt wrong. The tent looked like it had been there for months, yet the fire was recent, and there was that symbol carved into one of the nearby trees, a circle with an X through it. I'd never seen anything like it before. "Hello?" I called out, my voice seeming unnaturally loud in the quiet forest. "Is anyone here? This is Ranger Williams." No response came, not even an echo. It was as if the forest had swallowed my words. I approached the tent cautiously, one hand on my rifle. The zipper was partially open, and I could see a jumble of supplies inside, old cans of food, a tattered sleeping bag, and what looked like a journal. I reached for it, my curiosity overriding my sense of caution. That's when I heard it, a twig snapping somewhere behind me. I whirled around, heart pounding, but saw nothing but trees and shadows. The journal lay forgotten as I scanned the forest, straining my eyes and ears for any sign of movement. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Show yourself!" Only silence answered me. But as I stood there, surrounded by the deepening shadows of twilight, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching me. Something that didn't belong in these woods. Something that shouldn't exist. Little did I know, this was only the beginning. The true horror was yet to come, and it would challenge everything I thought I knew about the natural world and my place in it. But standing there in that clearing, with night falling fast and unknown eyes upon me, I made a decision that would change the course of my life. I turned and ran. My heart pounded in my chest as I ran, branches whipping against my face and arms. The forest I knew so well suddenly seemed alien and hostile. I didn't stop until I reached the main trail, my lungs burning and legs trembling from exertion. As I caught my breath, I fumbled for my radio. "Base camp, this is Williams. Do you copy?" My voice was shaky, and I hoped Marta wouldn't notice. After a moment of static, Marta's voice came through. "I copy, Arthur. Everything okay? You sound off." I hesitated, unsure of what to say. How could I explain what I'd seen, or thought I'd seen, without sounding crazy? I found an illegal campsite," I said finally. "Abandoned but recent. There's something strange about it. I'm heading back now." "Copy that. Be careful out there. It's getting dark." As if on cue, I noticed the lengthening shadows around me. Twilight was settling in, and with it came a whole new set of forest sounds. The hoot of an owl, the rustle of nocturnal creatures awakening. Normally these sounds were comforting, familiar. Tonight, they sent chills down my spine. I quickened my pace, eager to get back to the ranger station. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the undergrowth made me flinch. More than once I caught myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see what? I couldn't even put a name to the fear that gripped me. It was fully dark by the time I reached the station. Marta was still there, her face creasing with concern as I burst through the door. "Arthur, what happened out there? You look like you've seen a ghost." I slumped into a chair, suddenly exhausted. "I'm not sure, Marta. I found this campsite, way off the usual trails. But it was wrong somehow, and I felt like something was watching me." Marta listened patiently as I recounted the events of the day, the unnatural silence in the forest, the strange campsite, the symbol carved into the tree. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "That is odd," she said finally. "But Arthur, you know as well as I do that the forest can play tricks on your mind, especially when you're alone out there." I nodded, wanting to believe her, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was something more than my imagination running wild. That night, sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that symbol carved into the tree, felt the weight of unseen eyes upon me. I tossed and turned, my mind racing with possibilities, each more outlandish than the last. When dawn finally broke, I was already up and dressed. I knew what I had to do. I had to go back. I had to know if what I'd experienced was real, or just a product of an overactive imagination. Marta raised an eyebrow when I told her my plan, but she didn't try to stop me. Instead, she insisted on coming along. "Safety in numbers," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. We set out early, retracing my steps from the day before. The forest seemed different in the morning light, less menacing, more familiar. But as we approached the old logging road, that sense of wrongness returned. "There," I said, pointing to the marks I'd seen yesterday. "Do you see those tracks?" Marta knelt to examine them. "Odd," she murmured. "They're not animal tracks, that's for sure. But they're not human either." We followed the tracks down the old road, our pace slowing as we neared the clearing where I'd found the campsite. My hand tightened on my rifle as we pushed through the last of the undergrowth. The clearing was empty. No tent, no fire pit, no symbol carved into any of the trees. It was as if the campsite had never existed. "Are you sure this is the right place?" Marta asked, her voice gentle. I nodded, too stunned to speak. I walked to where the tent had been, searching for any sign of its presence. The ground was undisturbed, covered in a thick layer of pine needles and leaves. "I don't understand," I muttered. "It was right here. I know it was." Marta placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. "Maybe we should head back, Arthur. You've been under a lot of stress lately. Perhaps her words were cut off by a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the forest. We both froze, eyes wide, as the sound faded away. "What was that?" Marta whispered. Before I could answer, we heard it again. Closer this time. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It was something. "Run," I said, grabbing Marta's arm. "Run." We tore through the forest, branches scratching our faces, roots threatening to trip us at every step. The screams continued, always just behind us, getting closer and closer. We burst out onto the main trail, gasping for breath. The screams had stopped, but the forest around us was deathly silent once again. "We need to call this in," Marta said, her voice shaking. "Whatever that was, it's not normal." I nodded, still trying to catch my breath. "Agreed. But who's going to believe us?" The next few weeks were a blur of activity. We reported what we'd heard, of course, but without any physical evidence, there wasn't much the authorities could do. They conducted a cursory search of the area, but found nothing out of the ordinary. But things had changed in the forest. More hikers reported strange noises, unexplained shadows moving through the trees, and then the disappearances started. It began with a solo hiker who never returned from a day trip. Then a pair of campers vanished without a trace. As summer wore on, more people went missing. Search parties were organized, but they never found anything. No bodies, no equipment, nothing. The forest that had once been my sanctuary now felt like a prison. Every day, I'd patrol the trails, my eyes constantly scanning the trees, my ears straining for any unusual sound. More than once, I caught glimpses of something moving just at the edge of my vision. Something tall and thin, with unnaturally long limbs. But whenever I turned to look, it was gone. Months passed, and the disappearances continued. The authorities were baffled. Theories ranged from animal attacks to a serial killer hiding in the woods. But I knew the truth was something far stranger and more terrifying. As winter approached, I made a difficult decision. I couldn't stay in Clearwater any longer. The constant fear, the sleepless nights, the weight of knowing something was out there and being powerless to stop it. It was all too much. I put in for a transfer, citing stress and health concerns. My superiors were understanding. They'd seen the toll the recent events had taken on me. Within a month, I was reassigned to a small park in southern Idaho, far from the dense forests of Clearwater. But even as I drove away from Clearwater for the last time, watching the trees recede in my rearview mirror, I knew that this wasn't over. Whatever was in those woods, whatever had taken those people, it was still out there. And someday, somehow, I knew our paths would cross again. Years passed. I retired from the Park Service and settled into a quiet life in a small town. But I never forgot what happened in Clearwater. I kept track of the news, noting with a grim sort of satisfaction that the disappearances had stopped after I left. But every so often I'd hear rumors of strange sightings in other forests, of hikers going missing in circumstances that sounded all too familiar. And then, one evening as I sat on my porch watching the sunset, I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the woods behind my house. Tall and thin, with limbs too long to be human, and a face, if you could call it that, devoid of features. It watched me for a long moment, and I felt the weight of its gaze just as I had all those years ago in Clearwater. Then slowly, deliberately, it raised one elongated arm and beckoned to me before melting back into the shadows of the trees. I sit here now, writing this account, knowing that I have a choice to make. Do I ignore what I've seen, try to convince myself that it was a trick of the light or an overactive imagination? Or do I acknowledge the truth I've known deep down all these years, that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, things that lurk in the shadows of our forests, waiting? As I look out my window at the darkening woods, I know what I have to do. There are truths out there waiting to be uncovered, mysteries that need solving, and if not me, then who? Tomorrow, I'll pack my old ranger gear. I'll lace up my hiking boots, sling my rifle over my shoulder, and step into those woods. Whatever's out there, whatever has been watching and waiting all these years, I'll face it head on. Because some mysteries demand to be solved, no matter the cost, and some calls must be answered, even if they lead us into darkness. This is Arthur Williams, signing off. If you're reading this, and I haven't returned, well, you'll know where to start looking. But be careful. Be very, very careful. Because in the depths of the forest, in the spaces between the trees where shadows linger, something is waiting, and it's hungry.